name is Lindsay Reyes. I'm with Castle Group, and this is my partner,
Jerry Esposito, Castle Group.
We are business development, and we represent the Miami-Dade and Broward County regions. Brian Street, who is our Senior Vice President of Operations, is unable to attend today, so we will be filling in for him as moderators for this panel. We also have Sanisa Kolar with the Falcon Group. He's Principal Engineering, and Carolina Shear, Partner at Eisinger Law. So we will get into this. We'll be doing a quick overview of Carolina, and Sanisa can kind of touch base on the milestone inspections, the deadlines, the phases of the inspection, and the structural integrity reserves. We'll just briefly go over it so we can get right to the questions, and please go ahead and start asking.
Okay, so just really brief as a recap, what is the milestone inspection? This is a new requirement that applies statewide, which is an inspection of the structural components of buildings that are 3 stories or higher. And the inspection needs to be done by a licensed architect or structural engineer. There are phases of a milestone inspection. There are 2 phases. The initial is a general visual assessment of the conditions of the property. If the engineer in his experience determines that there are reasonable concerns as to the structural integrity of the property, then there's a second phase of the inspection that may involve additional destructive testing. The results of the inspection by the engineer are then provided to the association in the report format, as well as a summary, which the association will then have an obligation to disseminate to its respective unit owners. At the same time, the engineer will submit those reports to the local building authority. Let's go on to the next slide for the recap. So there are deadlines that we have to keep in mind for purposes of the recap. Buildings that are 3 stories or more must have their milestone inspection completed by December 31st of the year in which the building reaches 30 years of age. Now, for buildings that are within 3 miles of the coastline, and we don't have a clear definition of what coastline is, the milestone inspections are to occur at the 25-year birthday of the building. And then for both, they have to recertify or re-inspect 10 years thereafter. There is a catch-up period offered for buildings who had a certificate of occupancy before 1992. And those buildings have until December 2024 to complete their milestone inspection. But for everybody else, the time is now. Associations have to also complete a structural integrity reserve study every 10 years. This is slightly different than what your regular reserve studies are, or regular reserve components. And associations have until December 31st, 2024 to complete their structural integrity reserve study. Next. I already went through this as far as the milestone inspection, so it's a 2-phase. And what the structural integrity reserve study must include, which is based upon a visual inspection of a licensed engineer or architect, and they must identify the common areas being visually inspected, the remaining useful life, and replacement costs, and also provide a recommended annual reserve amount that achieves the estimated replacement costs or deferred maintenance expense.
Okay.
Now, I think with that, let's go ahead and turn to some of the questions.
First of all, Lori Sims, if you want to ask your question again in the chat, we'll go ahead and answer it. Lori Sims, if you can just re-ask your question. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, finish. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, just to start out the questions, I think the first one that we can start out with is a question from David. Is the milestone inspection report due by December 31st, 2024, or when you receive the notice? The answer that I've always gave, as far as even before these milestone inspections started, is that by the time that you receive a notice from your local municipality, it's too late. Because by the time that you receive the notice that you have to be in compliance, you will only have 180 days to have, in essence, bring your building in full compliance. And that is not enough time for you to assess the building, have the building, hire the engineer, have the engineer prepare the reports. So for those buildings, in my opinion, for those buildings that have to get this done, you have to start beforehand. Anissa, do you agree?
So first and foremost, good afternoon, everybody. The whole reason why we organize this, and I think we need to start with that, and for all of you that you were with us the first time, is we're trying to answer questions that unfortunately not even us 100% sure how to answer. So I guess we just wanted to share our pain with the rest of you and understand that, when you ask us these questions, you might not get the definitive answer that you're looking for. The rule of the thumb so far was that the submittal of any reports was not possible before you receive an actual notification from the municipality, from the building department, which means what I think Carolina is trying to convey here is start preparing for this if you know that you are gonna be doing this. But I'm not pretty sure that you will be able to submit the report prior to receiving the letter or prior to receiving the notification. At the end of the day, we have to look into what the intent of all of this is. And intent of all of this is to make sure that we maintain our properties. And if we maintain our properties, all of this becomes one big administrative process and nothing more than that. So maybe the best answer to this question is prepare for the submittals, but most likely you will be able to submit only after you receive the notification. Now, I want to answer another question that kind of ties into this, and maybe also in the order how it was received. John Troxell asked a question. Okay, we are within 3 miles, but we are over 25 years. Do we get a grace period? And unfortunately, you don't. So at this point, what we understand is no grace period was provided for anybody that is not before, doesn't have a CO before the 1992, which means you kind of fall into this end of the year category. So that would imply that you have until the end of this year to finish this particular milestone inspection. The structural reserve study is that you have until 2025, I believe, but for the actual milestone inspection, I think you have to complete it by the end of this year. Again, going back to my previous comment about did you get a notification from the building department, because I think that was one of the requirements. If you haven't, you kind of don't have to do it, but the chances are you will get a letter at some point. So going back to my original comment, start preparing for it, because chances are you're going to get notification and then you're going to have very short period of time to complete this. So this is something that you should definitely start working on this.
So there's a question, and I keep getting this question. Well, we have a 2-year study, 2-year condo. Does this apply? Well, just because the state milestone inspection requirements and the state reserve requirements only apply to buildings that are 3 stories and above, the milestone inspection, or the equivalent in Miami-Dade and Broward County, which is the 40-year recertification, will still apply to you. The reserve, right now, the way that the language of the statute is set, the structural integrity reserve requirements only apply to buildings that are 3 stories and higher.
Okay. I think Lori Sims asked a question. We are a new building with 3 buildings, 2 are occupied and 1 is not currently occupied. Are we going to have to do this for all 3 buildings simultaneously? I think that's a little bit of a technical question. Our experience with situations like this, just going from the 40-year from Miami-Dade and Broward, is that the notifications are going to be received based on the folio numbers. And if 3 buildings are different folio numbers, chances are you're going to get 3 different notifications if they're different timelines. Considering that this new legislation says that you have 180 days to complete this in the year where you are, turning 30 and all of that, you kind of can start preparing for it, which means basically, even though 3 buildings may not be occupied at the same time, if they're occupied in the same year, chances are, or they get a CO in the same year, chances are you will be doing that in the same year. If they are not, then you will do it at a different times. And I just want to differentiate between milestone inspection and structural reserve studies. The milestone inspection pertains to 25 years and 30 years of the properties, depending on their location in accordance to the shoreline, the coastal line. The structural reserve study applies to all the condos that are, I believe, 3 stories or higher. So no matter how old you are, there is a good chunk of this law that deals with this right from the onset, even putting some requirements on the developers of the properties as to preparing for the turnover process and turning over the property to the association. So structural reserve study is something that we're going to have to do no matter what age the building is. Milestones apply to 25 and 30-year-old properties, again, depending on the location from the coast.
Okay, just to reiterate, we're getting questions as to what is included in the structural, what components are included in the structural reserve study. So I just want to go over it, and then Sunitha, maybe we can just touch upon whether or not it's feasible to even do this. They're looking at roof, load-bearing walls or other primary structural members, floor, foundation, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and then there's a $10,000 catch-all.
So just again, a clarification on that. We have to differentiate between milestone inspection and structural reserve study. Milestone inspection pertains to the structural stability of the property. Reserve study pertains to the items that Carolina just listed there. So when we are doing the milestone inspections, those are visual inspections. The purpose of those inspections to determine whether your building is safe for its present use and occupancy, or would we need to do anything else? The structural reserve studies, the purpose of that is to help the associations prepare for future restoration projects and have funds available for those items that are listed in that reserve study, so you would be able to lessen the burden from an upcoming project that may delay the necessary repairs because of the funding problems. There are a lot of questions that, there are not a lot, but I read some of the questions that pertain to, foundations. How do you inspect foundations? It's a great question. There's a lot of these things that how do you inspect structural system of the building is completely covered with finishes. How do you inspect fireproofing that is hidden inside the wall? So there are a lot of questions. How do you inspect that? The intent, again, if we are looking from a perspective of structural reserves, the idea is not necessarily to replace the foundations. Obviously, I would assume that is impossible without removing the building, which is, we have to, at least we are trying to read beyond the verbatim language in the statute, which is the intent of this is help us prepare for future projects. So assumption is that when engineer does inspection, and by the way, the structural reserves, the way the language is written, mandate that those inspections for structural reserves be performed by a professional engineer. So you have to hire an engineer, will have to do that inspection, that engineer will determine whether there is a possibility or anything indicating that there is a potential foundation problem, and will have to associate certain type of a repair or dollar amount to that repair. And again, the time frame from when that repair has to happen, and then allow you to fund the money over that time period. So when the time comes to repair that, you have the money to repair it. I think we're having a problem with lack of separation what meaning of a reserve study is in conventional way, which is, hey, I have a roof and supposed to last 20 years, and the cost to replace a roof is $100,000. So it's easy. I know in 20 years I have to replace it, 100,000 divided by 20 years. That's how much money I need. Now, when we start throwing in stuff like foundations, floors, structural members, and things like that, they don't have necessarily a lifespan, because the lifespan of those systems is the lifespan of the building. So replacement of those systems means replacing the building, which is not what we are trying to do here. We are trying to anticipate the cost of the repairs that the building might have when the next time is to do that. The question is, when is the next time? And I will tell you, this is not in the statute, even though they say every 10 years. First and foremost, the 10 years period is too long for any structural, for any reserve item. You should follow the practice of updating your reserves on a regular basis, whether that be every 2 years, every 3 years, every time there's a major shift in the market, because that is going to impact your ability to have enough money when the time comes. Don't wait 10 years to update your reserves. That's number one. And number two, this structural reserve study is not going to be your conventional reserve study where we have a lifespan and we divide it. It's going to be a way more unknowns and estimates. So think of it as an auxiliary budget for your next project, where hopefully you will have sufficient money. So when the time comes, and let's assume you have a $5 million project ahead of you, you don't have to scramble to assess for $5 million because you have 3.5 in your reserves. So now you say, okay, we only are short 1.5, and that's manageable. We can get it way faster. All of this comes from, and I'll finish with this, all of this comes from the problem that Champlain Tower was, and many other buildings were, luckily with no consequences. And that is, you are put into the position when there is a $15 million assessment ahead of you and you have nothing. So funding $15 million is time consuming. I know that today we all want to think, yeah, somebody says $15 million and we're just going to go and find $15 million somewhere. That's not easy. So the idea is we want to shorten, or the legislation wants to shorten the gap with what you need and what you have.
Great. Okay, so we have a few more here. So we have one from Scott. How does an association calculate the amount of reserves needed to comply with the new legislation?
So the association doesn't. Same like reserve studies. Reserve studies are done by reserve specialists. These are also going to be done by a reserve specialist in combination with the engineer, or combination of the two, where the engineer is going to provide some estimates of what needs to happen and what the cost is. That's going to be plugged in into the reserve study projections, and that is going to be given to the association as what is their reserve going to look like at the end of the year.
We had a question as to whether or not we can pool the structural integrity reserve funds. The way that we're reading the statute right now, the answer would be no, because you are not able to utilize the structural integrity reserves for alternate purposes. If you cannot utilize your structural integrity reserves for alternative purposes, then the explanation that follows would be that we're not able to pool them. Again, with the difficulties and the numbers that you need to set aside to perhaps address a foundation, which is invisible, it does seem a little bit unreasonable to have to set aside those kind of monies and not even be able to pool them.
So, and this is, again, going back to my previous comment about we are not 100% sure about certain things. Where I agree 100% with Carolina is that you cannot pool them with your conventional reserves. Now, an argument can be made, the way the language is written, that you can potentially pool reserves for structural things versus pools for everything else. So technically you have two pools, one for structural, one for non-structural. But again, if you want to be 100% on the safe side and read the statute to the letter, I'm pretty sure one can make a very strong argument that no, this has to be a component funding straight line, each line item for itself.
Okay, so let's talk about how intrusive these inspections are going to be. Marcia's asking whether or not, and she's saying structural integrity inspections. Again, let's try to not confuse the concept of structural integrity reserves versus the milestone inspections. So what she's asking is, to what degree do we believe that the inspections will need to inspect load-bearing walls within units beyond common areas? And I'm going to defer to Sinisa, but my answer is, when an engineer inspects, they usually take a percentage of the units, and they inspect the interior of the units, because if there are structural load-bearing, and Sinisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but if there are structural members that are within the interior of the units, they have to also inspect those.
So milestone inspections are visual, phase one. Structural integrity reserve inspections are also visual. The fact is that the law wants us to inspect foundations, wants us to inspect load-bearing walls, wants us to inspect floors and all those things, wants to inspect plumbing, wants us to inspect electrical. All of those are hidden inside. It's literally impossible to properly evaluate every one of those. So if we use common practices that have been used in this industry for a long time now in assessing those type of systems, some destructive investigation might be necessary to uncover some of the systems in the building, such as risers for plumbing or fire sprinkler lines or something like that. For structural purposes, most likely, everything is going to be based on visual inspections and some potential non-destructive investigation on the building. For structural integrity, if we need to do destructive investigation because you have problems, we're now going away from reserve studies and we're going into immediate repairs. So that's what's confusing about this. How do you do two in one? If I see cracks on the building that are problematic, you have to repair them right away. There is no reserve for that. And that's going to be the most challenging part of this entire aspect.
So I know we're jumping around a lot, but that's how we have 33 open questions. I have several questions from different owners in the Miami-Dade, Broward County area, where they have buildings that recently passed their certification, their 40-year certification. So that it's a two-topic question. One, if I already passed my 40-year, do I have to comply with the milestone inspection requirements? And two, if I'm not a building that's higher than 3 stories, what do I have to do now? Do I still have to do the 40-year certification requirement? So the short answer, and then I'll defer to Sinisa, is that the milestone inspection, this statute that we're speaking about today, is statewide, okay? The 40-year certification that we are familiar with is only in Miami-Dade and Broward counties presently. As far as I'm concerned, we still have to comply with the 40-year certification requirements. However, the milestone requirements appear to be more expansive than what the 40-year certification requirements are. Is that correct?
It's relatively similar. Again, because it has phase 1 and phase 2, it's different. But if you pass the 40-year for Miami-Dade, chances are you're going to pass milestone as well. The thing is, you just have to probably produce another report. Maybe the state will allow same report to be used because they don't have a per se a report format right now that they want to use.
So are you telling me that there's no present checklist for the engineers or a report format that was issued with the statute?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. It's left to the interpretation of the engineer to determine whether the building is safe for its present use and occupancy, and if so, provide some kind of information or letter stating that, and then if not, go to phase two, determine the extent of the problem, the magnitude, the type, define repair protocols, and then go into the whole restoration process where you're going to bring the building back into its original or safe condition.
Sinisa, I think you touched upon this before. David Couch has a question regarding clarification of when you talk about foundation replacement or structural replacement. It's not about the replacement. There are many methods to correct foundation or structural issues that do not require building replacement, et cetera, as has been stated. You had touched upon repair versus replacement, and I believe that's what he's referring to.
Correct. And again, I just want to clarify. Reserve study, the implication of the reserve study is replacing a system in the building when it reaches the end of its lifespan. And so we are funding the replacement of a system. If we read this with the same intent and somebody says, I want you to include foundation, one can interpret that to be, I want you to tell me when the foundations are going to fail and have to be replaced, right? What we are trying to say is that is not necessarily the intent. The intent is we need to establish if any work needs to be done on foundation to make sure that they're safe and stable and operate, function the way they are, and then put that money for that purpose and establish time frame when that should be done. So we are not talking about quote unquote reserve. We're talking about reserving money for future maintenance.
Denisa, how do we define 3 stories? Some of these buildings have like a covered parking on the first floor and then actual residential units on floors 2 and then 3. Would that be 3 stories, or do we start at the residential level?
No. It's 3 stories. It's 3 stories. It's height of the building. One can say, well, what if I have a double height ceilings, right? And I have a loft and no floor or a high atrium or something like that. Is that 1 floor or 2 floors? The height implies that there are 3 levels, whether they are for garage, whether they are for the people living there, and that's probably some of the clarifications are going to have to be put in there. So far, it's been interpreted as 3 floors above the ground.
Right. What are going to be the credentials? The statute says licensed architect, professional engineer, or licensed engineer. Are there any additional credentials for somebody to complete the milestone or structural integrity?
Not at this present.
Studies?
No. The only thing you have to be is a licensed engineer. I would assume, even though I'm not sure the exact language in the law, but it would have to be a licensed engineer in the trade of engineering, not just any licensed engineer. So it has to be a licensed engineer in the field of structural engineering.
But it's not a requirement that someone be a threshold or special inspector, correct?
Not at this point, no.
Okay.
The questions keep coming.
Yeah. I think Carolina, let's leave some to you. I believe this could be yours. Okay, building completed in 2007. This is from Robertson Bennett. Less than 3 miles from the coast. I understand that an inspection must be completed by 12/31/2024. I understand that a structural inspection must be completed at the end of 25 years, which is 2032 for the building I have referenced. Please explain the distinction between the 2024 inspection and the 2032 inspection. Thank you.
In essence, there's no distinction in it happens every 10 years. Statute does not make a distinction or a difference as to the inspections that happen at the 10-year interval. The assessment by the engineer is going to be the same exact assessment. They're going to a phase 1. They will do a visual inspection of the components, If they determine that a phase 2 needs to happen, they will do that, and it happens every 10 years. If, for example, you're in Miami-Dade and Broward and you have your 40-year, well, that's already in place, that in the 50-year, you also have to complete an inspection. There's no difference between the 40-year and the 50-year. It's the same process that our engineers go through for the 50-year certification and 60-year. I don't know how many that are at this year. Most are at their 40 and 50, approaching their 60, but nobody really, a lot of our buildings are not that old. But basically, it's the same exact procedure that we will have to follow.
Okay. We have a question from Gary. We plan to do one inspection that can gather the necessary information for the City of Boca Phase 1 for the state and visual inspection for the Structural Integrity Reserve. Can we submit the inspections much earlier than the actual deadlines for each?
My understanding is no, you have to wait for the letter. But that being said, nothing prevents you from trying. And if you already have somebody doing the work, let them try to submit and say this is based on the new law and see what happens. Our experience is that cities usually don't allow it because what I would assume is an administrative process. They need to create something that is going to trigger where do you log in certain pieces of the information being received to check appropriate boxes. Again, unfortunately, these are things that are not necessarily 100% clear as to what this is. Again, I just want to, there are a bunch of questions that pertain to this. Structural reserve studies will have to be done no matter what age of the building is. And I believe that they also pertain only to buildings that are 3 stories or higher. Milestone inspections that also pertain to those buildings have to be done at 25 and 30. So structural reserve studies, every building, no matter of the age, and you have to keep them fully funded. So let's touch base on that. There are a couple of questions about that. This law does not prevent you from having your conventional reserve studies. This law just say you have to have this type of a study. You can still have your HVAC, your elevators, your hallways, your gym equipment, your other things in a completely unrelated reserve study, separate account. If you want to pull those, you can. You should pull all the other reserve items. The structural ones have to be separate. Depending on interpretation, you might be able to pull those individually or just keep them in a component straight line funding. So you can have 2 lines of reserves. Now, having structural reserves doesn't mean that you have to have other reserves. The reserve law for general items in the building has not changed to the best of my knowledge. So just because you have to have structural ones doesn't mean you have to have any other ones. And then structural ones, you cannot waive, you cannot partially fund. So whatever the estimates are, you have to fund for those estimates. And somebody asked the question, well, there are going to be discrepancies. How can you properly evaluate? Absolutely right. There are going to be big discrepancies, potentially. Somebody's going to tell you, listen, you need $300,000 for this restoration project. And then when you get to that project, it turns out to be $700,000. And you're going to be like, these guys don't know what they're doing. They told us 3, look, it's 7. That's what I'm saying. You have to update your studies, at least if not through inspections, at least to account for changes in cost of materials, labor, and all of that. To make sure that you close in the gap, chances of you having all the money you need in those reserves for the structural repairs that you're going to have to do, in my opinion, are very unlikely. But it's going to be some money that is going to be there. It is going to make it far easier for you to do the repairs when the time comes.
Yeah, Carolina, we have a lot of questions on that exactly. The reserves. Can this be, how does this work in conjunction with the existing budget? You know, how there's a lot of questions about what the dollar amount will be. You know, I think Sunisa touched on that a little bit, but can you just elaborate a little on how does this roll into their existing budget, their existing reserves, and, you know, how is this going to work going forward?
Well, keep in mind that when an association, let's take this new, the new requirements aside. Let's just work on what we had, the framework that we had before. When an association adopts a budget, you have essentially two components to your budget. You have your operating budget for your regular recurring expenses, and then you have a separate reserve schedule to your budget, okay? That gets adopted no matter what. The board, as the statute reads now, the board adopts the budget with fully funded reserves. The membership then has the option, by a vote of the majority of the members at a meeting at which quorum is attained, to waive or partially waive those reserves. If the membership doesn't do that, then your budget is adopted with fully funded reserves. Let's bring in this new requirement. This new requirement now will have, the way I foresee this, and I would defer to you guys in management because you assist in the preparation of this, but the way I would see this probably would be you have your budget, then you have your Schedule A of your traditional reserves, and then maybe a Schedule B structural integrity reserves. And at the end of the day, it's going to work the same exact way. The board is going to have to adopt that budget with both the Schedule B, Schedule A, and the Schedule B. That's how it's going to be done. Now with the schedule, you know, and I'm creating a name, a Schedule B, but with the structural reserve, integrity reserves, there won't be a vote of the membership as of right now. There will be no waiver of those reserves. So what that's going to do for many of our associations, based upon the sheer cost of some of these components, as Sunisa has outlined, it's going to be very difficult to be able to, for some of our associations to afford to fund these requirements, and it's going to trickle down. It's going to be very hard for our members to be able to fund these requirements. There has to be, or I would hope that whenever they do a glitch bill, they consider this and maybe come up with some sort of formula that will assist or defray the costs a little bit. Penalties. I had a few questions. Well, what's the penalty? The ultimate penalty, obviously, the ultimate penalty right now is that your building official is going to shut your building down if you don't comply. And that's written within the statute that the building official may have the discretion to deem the building unsafe for occupancy. The other thing that they built into the statute for board members is that a failure to comply with these requirements is deemed to be a breach of a fiduciary duty on the part of the board of directors. So it's very important to understand that there will be consequences there. There will be, once the local building officials get into a process, and we're seeing it now in especially in Miami-Dade and Broward. If you fail to comply, they issue notices of violation. You have to start going to the magistrate hearings, or they'll refer it to the unsafe structures boards, and they do assess penalties. And in some cases where there's been a failure to comply, they've red tagged the building, and they've issued a building to be unsafe for occupancy.
Carolina, this is actually an interesting question that came in from Linda. What does it look like? You know, a lot of these are new, right? Their boards are kind of adjusting and digesting all the requirements now. And it seems like there isn't so much clarity on how this is going to be implemented. Linda asked, what does it look like when a board overreacts to the law? So what is there such thing, you know, as overreacting to what is going to be in existence in reality?
It's hard to say because we don't know how this is going to play out in practice entirely. We have, you know, between you guys as management, Sunisa as the engineering consultant, and myself as legal, we have an idea of the hurdles that are going to be faced. But I don't know what an overreaction right now would look like, since the statute itself, I don't want this to be misinterpreted. I believe that the statute has good intentions and it's a good step in the right direction. But I think that some aspects of the statute could be deemed an overreaction in that they're not well thought out as to what the implications, the practical implications upon association operations will be. So yes, it's a good step in the right direction, and I think we need to have these measures in place for the benefit of all. But I think we also need to look at a practical perspective and make sure that we make it achievable for our associations to comply. So I can't answer whether they're overreacting or not, because I think we need to modify the statute. But that brings me to a good point. I've gotten a lot of kickback, and Sunisa, what is your thought from an engineering perspective? I've gotten a lot of kickback on the statute saying this is the government stepping in and babysitting and micromanaging our associations. The associations are individual corporations, and the unit owners should have a say in how their property is administered. What say you as an engineer to that?
Well, I don't disagree. I think that they should definitely have a say in how they manage and administer their property. But I also believe that given the dire consequences of association deciding not to do anything about it, that we have to take that a step back. In the end of the day, the entire logic behind this, same as logic behind 40-year inspection for Broward and Dade, was we're gonna let you do whatever you want as long as you maintain your property. And in this aspect, this legislation is doing two things. Number one, making sure you have enough money to maintain your property. And number two, telling you at 25 years or 30 years of the property, we're coming in to check, have you maintained your property? And if you didn't, we will impose action on you to make sure that you do. I understand the whole concept of, well, you don't get to tell me what do I do with my property. But at the same time, not doing anything with a building, as we can all see, whether it has any impact or not, but can have a very catastrophic consequences. And I don't think it can be left to people alone to say, well, we're going to decide. Well, yeah, within the confinements on your unit, you can decide. But in reality, you have surrounding properties, you have workers, you have people working in those buildings, management team, maintenance team, you have guests. So all of those people are the people that have to make, you have to make sure that they are protected as well. So when we talk about that, I don't think this is a government outreach. I think this is a checkpoint where we say, okay, let's just make sure that you are maintaining your building. One can say, well, but this is now making a burden on me to live in this property, right? I cannot live in this property. May not be the best analogy, but I will say, if at some point in my life I was able to buy a Lamborghini, and today I cannot pay to maintain that Lamborghini, unfortunately, I cannot drive that Lamborghini anymore. I know that's a very harsh, very, like it is what it is type of a concept, but in reality it is. Living in a building has always been not just how much you pay to live there, to buy a property, but it was always about how much you have to pay to be able to maintain that property so you can be living in there. So in that sense, I think, this is gonna create a lot of burden. I'm pretty sure a lot of burden on the unit owners in the buildings. There is a lot of concern about that, but that's why we are trying to, Karina said that there is a glitch law. A lot of these things, if the laws are clarified, are gonna make these burdens way lesser on the buildings and are going to allow people to fund appropriate amount of money. And
So when we talk about a, sorry, can you just finish and then I'll.
No.
Go ahead.
I need somebody to
When we talk about a glitch bill, when we talk about a glitch bill, we had about some people have dropped off. We had about 190 people show up today. We had, I can't remember how many we had. The success of a glitch bill and these suggestions that Sunisa, myself, or your management team may have will be strengthened if you all reach out to your representatives and let them know of the glitches, because they may not necessarily hear us, by ourselves, but they'll certainly hear you guys as voters, and you can assist in maybe addressing some of these issues, because you're the ones that are going to be directly impacted by the results of the glitches that we're seeing.
It's very important, and this ties into a question that John asked. With the current legislation, if we want this done the right way, there are not enough engineers or reserve study specialists or other professionals that can fulfill these requirements in such a short period of time. The reserve specialists not necessarily have engineers on staff that can do these structural inspections. Mind you, these inspections should be done and have to be done by a structural engineer, not because that's the law, but because that makes sense. You need an engineer to tell you whether there is a problem, how to fix that problem, and how much it's going to cost you. But you have to also take into account that there are 15, 20, 30,000 condos. And I don't know how many reserve study companies and what is the ability of those companies to do that, let alone to talk about engineering companies that can do that. Remember, this is not, we all woke up today and this is the first thing and the only thing we're going to do from now on. There are ongoing projects, there are constant projects done here in Florida. So this is going to be a challenge. And that's one of the questions that people have commonly asked, who is going to do this? These things are definitely something that has to be somehow clarified, as well as I said, items from these structural reserve studies, so they don't become such a burden on the association that people simply cannot live there. There has to be something that is going to allow and marry the two, the ability to maintain the property and the ability to live in the property. That has to, find a sweet spot. There was a question by Marcia. Let me see, not to butcher somebody's name. Marcia. She asked, how do you expect that visual inspection by an engineer will be able to determine the safety of electrical and plumbing? So right now, the inspections that we do in Miami-Dade and Broward for electrical, for example, are done visual. Miami-Dade recently put in a requirement to do a thermographic study of the electrical lines, but even that is not as quote-unquote destruct investigation, just removal of the panel covers and doing the thermography report. So that's commonly done in the industry right now. The engineers that are in this business should be able to determine the problems on the building, or at least determine that there is a problem on the building by visual inspection, which, if there is, would prompt an engineer to go into the phase 2, which would then be, hey, we need to do this type of investigation, this type of testing, we need to chip here, chip there. When it comes to plumbing, safety aspect of plumbing mostly is water intrusion, pipe breaks, and all of that. This is going to be going more along the lines of checking the risers, making sure if they are in good condition, which is going to be related to collecting information from the property about pipe breakages, instances of floods and whatnot, along with some visual investigation and selective destructive investigation in the common areas. I just want to address one more thing. I think it's important. Windows. Windows are a critical thing, and the question is, well, windows are owned by unit owners, by the condo. The intent, and Carolina is probably going to be better equipped to answer this, but the intent of this law is to address common areas, common elements. So the windows, same as plumbing, same as anything else, will be for the common areas, right? So if we have common areas windows such as lobby windows and something like that, that would be included. If you have, rest of the windows are the unit owner responsibilities, then they would not be included in this type of work.
Yeah, I don't know that I interpret it that way initially. I get the common area argument, but at the same time, the counter argument for that is that leaking windows or damaged windows are often the root of many of the problems. You can have water intrusion into the windows, and that can then result in damage to other components of the building. So I can see why they would have asked for reserves for windows, but what they didn't take into account is that under many of these governing documents, windows are the responsibility of the homeowner. So that really needs to be clarified. I don't necessarily think that we could just limit it to common area windows when the intent of it's not only that the common elements are structurally safe, that the windows, and you're probably going to tell me that windows are not necessarily structural, right? In some cases. So, it's a fine line between practical and your knowledge as an engineer. I don't know what they were thinking when they drafted that, whether they thought it was the windows of the whole building without even consulting someone like you or someone like me as to what it means practically in a building. We're starting to run out of time and we still have 22 questions, but someone made a very good observation. What engineer in their right mind, in essence, is going to only go and do a phase one and take on the liability of a possible failure and not recommend a phase two? I get our participants' point. It seems to me that engineers are going to be very busy for the years to come based on this law. And there really isn't anything, I would assume that from a liability perspective as an engineer, you would always want to recommend a phase two and do some sort of destructive testing to just cover yourself. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the liability of the engineers is a common topic, and it's the same topic as the 40 years. What prevented engineers doing 40 years to just go and tell the building that they have to go and do all this destructive investigation? Many of you that have gone through a 40-year inspection in Broward in Dade know that the engineers don't go and destroy the building just to prove that the building is safe or not safe. We rely on visual inspections. If you think this is a way for an engineer to go in and make some money, well, yeah, definitely there is a component of that, and one can interpret the law and says this is an open checkbook for engineers to do whatever they want. Is there going to be situations like that? I'm pretty sure it will. I mean, can people take advantage of this? Yes, of course they can. My thing on this is the same as anything else. You have to do your homework, your due diligence in hiring the appropriate party that you can rely on, that they are going to be able to give you the true results without doing all kinds of things for something they could potentially have told you from the beginning. Those are the things, unfortunately, that we have to deal with without this law. This exists for any project that you are doing. I've heard a statement that I like. I don't know who I can attribute that to, but it's true for what we have, and that is you have to trust your professional, no matter who or what that person is, but you have to maintain a healthy dose of paranoia. So basically, trust them, but be cautious. And unfortunately, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know by yourself. That's the only thing you have for you. I hope that answers a little bit.
I want to just thank everyone. We're winding down here, a few minutes left, but the participation from all of our viewers and listeners, both in last webinar and this one, has been sensational. We have done our best to answer as many questions as possible, and I know our panelists are appreciative of that too. But as we wind down here, one of the most common questions that has come up, both in 1 and 2, and we touched on it a little bit, was about common areas. What is a common area? Obviously, we know the easy ones, right? The pools and the clubhouses, but load-bearing walls, foundations, HOAs versus condos. Carolina, how do you determine what's technically a common area, and is it about their documents?
So it's very document specific. If you're in a condo, HOA is separate. If you're in a condo, what you will have is your declaration of condominium is going to have a specific section that's going to define what a common element is, and then it will have a specific section that will define what the unit is. Full disclosure, some documents are horribly drafted and completely ambiguous. So sometimes it is very difficult to determine the distinction between what a common element is and what a unit is. But generally speaking, or the concept that we always have in our head is drywall in unit, drywall out common element, excuse me. That is like the rule of thumb, but there are exceptions. Is the crawl space a common element? Are the pipes? The pipes are the biggest difficulty in determining whether it's a common element or whether it's not. There's usually language that will say, well, if it serves more than one unit, it's a common element. If it only serves that unit, and then you have my poor managers trying to figure out whether a pipe serves one unit or more units, and they don't know. Walls, sometimes we don't know whether a wall is a structural wall or just a internal partition. And usually the internal partitions are deemed the unit, and the perimeter walls are deemed to be common elements. Always drywall in, drywall out. HOAs, it's different because in HOAs you usually have a single family home, and your common areas are easier to define. There are going to be your roadways, your clubhouse. But we have some developments that are like townhome HOAs that have, they're structured as an HOA, but they really look more like a condo. And again, we have to look at the governing documents and the description of what each lot is and how the common areas are defined in the governing documents. So it's not crystal clear. It's very site and document specific.
Great.
Carolina, I'm sorry, can we answer one question that I think it's important, and it pertains to fully funded reserves. And people are asking, what does that mean? And what does it mean to be fully funded or fully funding? And I think those are two different things. Fully funded means, I would assume, and I will leave that to you to clarify, what I interpret from the legislation is that you cannot partially fund the reserves, which means if the reserve requirement in the end of the year, I'm going to throw a number, is $100,000 for that year for these items, you have to make sure that you contribute the full $100,000 that year. Now, does that mean that you have to play a catch up? And let's say that if you have had reserved for the past 5 years, you should have had $500,000, and today you have only $200,000. Does that mean that in the first year you have to catch up the $300,000 that you didn't do from the past X years? I think that's a bigger question.
The statute doesn't necessarily answer that question. If you previously properly waived your reserves and now you find yourself in a requirement that you have to fully fund, I don't know that you have to now retroactively catch up. But what you would do in that situation is have a new reserve study, rework your calculations, and start funding based on the new calculations. So it might, I'm not a math expert. I don't know if it yields the same result, but I know both results are going to mean that it's more money for the association, right? But I don't know about having to play catch up as much as having a properly performed reserve study, setting up what the number is, and start funding correctly moving forward.
The reason I'm asking that, Carolina, is very important. I have heard so many times in the past years, past weeks, since this new legislation, the comment was, and it goes along, well, there are some people that claim that they know everything that, this new legislation is, and they're offering services left and right. Going back to what, like I said, is there a way that somebody can take advantage of this? I'm sure there is. But there are already comments, banks are offering loans so you can fully fund the reserves, and you just take a short-term or long-term loan, and that's going to help you bridge the gap. So I just think it's very important for people to understand what does fully funding the reserve means. It's a contribution based on the calculation that you have to do for that time period, not necessarily that now you have to go and take a loan for $1 million that you didn't do for the past 3 years and just shove it in there so you can say, hey, I funded my reserves.
No. I mean, look, the goal here is have your reserve study, determine that number, and once you have that number, you fund that number. I think it would be counterproductive to go backwards at this point. But again, it's almost like one large disclaimer that we have to stamp on this chat. There are a lot of answers that we don't necessarily know. We're just offering based on our overall knowledge and our practical knowledge, but it's kind of like the weather person. It's a 50% chance of rain, and they don't have to commit to know. We don't know the answers to everything, and we're trying to learn as we go along and impart that information to our audience.
The good thing is you have to do milestone inspection, which in my opinion is pretty straightforward, and I think that there are not many unknowns with the milestone inspections. So you have to get a professional is going to do the inspection, give you a report saying yay or nay, and go from there. So I think when it comes to milestone inspections, things are much clearer than where they are with the reserve study. But because the time frame for reserve study to start doing this is in 2020, end of 2024, and we are really hoping that in next legislative session in 2023 there is going to be a lot of these things answered. Maybe you don't rush into the structural reserve studies yet. I'm not saying don't do them, but maybe do them in phases for items that what can be done. You start doing them for items that you're not sure. Maybe wait until the next legislative session so you get the clarifications, and maybe you don't do things twice or 3 times.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we need to wrap up now. I just wanted to thank the panelists, Anissa and Carolina, for being the experts on this. Everybody's asking questions. We're all kind of on the same boat here. So we appreciate you giving your opinions and helping us all navigate through this interesting time. Thank you to all the participants as well. Your questions were extremely detailed and very thought out. So the participation was, again, incredible in this webinar. Just so everybody knows, I will send you the slides. We had a lot of questions on, people want to review the slides that we had. So I will send them over to you as well. And all of our webinars can be found on our website. They'll be posted about 24 hours after we end it. So if you wanted to go back and see part 1, you can go on to castlegroup.com and view our webinars. And if you have any issues, please email me directly. My name is Lindsay, and it's lreyes@castlegroup.com. But let me see if I can send a chat to everybody so that I can spell out my email so everybody has it. I'll just put it here. And the panelists' emails are behind you on the screen, so you have their contact information as well. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Happy 4th.
Bye.